The moon hung low over Carson Creek, spilling pale light over the silent, dusty streets. Every door was shut tight, every window shuttered against the kind of business that happened after dark. But Eleanor May Hutchkins was still awake. She pressed her back to the rough wall of the general store, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole town might hear it. In her trembling hands, she clutched a carpet bag that held her entire life, 2 faded dresses, her mother's worn Bible, and $17 saved over 3 long, lonely years. Inside the saloon next door, Big Jim Calhoun's laughter boomed like thunder, the sound of a man who believed the world and everyone in it belonged to him. Tomorrow he was coming for her. Her stepfather had signed a marriage contract to pay his gambling debts, trading Eleanor like cattle to settle his losses. She had seen Big Jim's wives before, bruises hidden beneath silk sleeves, empty eyes behind painted smiles. Eleanor had promised herself she'd never be one of them. She would rather die alone in the desert than live as a rich man's prisoner. A cloud drifted across the moon, dimming the light. Now or never. She slipped along the wall toward the stable behind the saloon. Young Tommy, the stable boy, had left the door unlatched, just as he'd promised. He'd seen the fear in her eyes that afternoon and, for $2 and a whispered prayer, agreed to help her escape. Inside, her father's old mare, Buttercup, lifted her head with a soft nicker of recognition. Eleanor ran a trembling hand down the horse's muzzle. "Shh, girl," she whispered. "We've got to run now. I know you're tired, but we can't stay." Her hands shook as she saddled the horse. Every sound seemed deafening. The creak of leather, the jingle of a buckle. She froze at every gust of wind, waiting for Big Jim's heavy boots to thunder down the alley. But the night stayed still, and when the saddle was secured, she led Buttercup out into the open. Beyond the town limits stretched nothing but darkness and sagebrush, an ocean of emptiness. Somewhere out there might be freedom or death. She took one last look at Carson Creek, at the town that had been her cage, and swung into the saddle. Buttercup's hooves struck the hard earth, carrying her away from everything she'd ever known. The first miles passed in a blur of fear and cold air. She expected to hear shouts at any moment, the thunder of horses behind her. But the only sound was the wind and the faint rhythm of Buttercup's breathing. When dawn began to paint the sky in pale gold, Eleanor realized she'd gone farther than she ever had in her life. By mid-morning, exhaustion set in. She stopped near a dry creek bed where a few cottonwoods offered shade. Buttercup drank the last of the water from the canteen, and Eleanor sat with her back against a tree, staring at the endless horizon. It hit her then. There was no going back. The desert didn't care about her fear or her tears. It offered only survival to those strong enough to fight for it. When the sun burned high, she rested. When night came, she rode again. 3 days passed like that, each one harder than the last. The water ran out. Her lips cracked. Buttercup stumbled more often, and Eleanor's hope began to fade. On the 4th morning, she saw movement on the ridge ahead. A man on horseback, his figure dark against the rising sun. He sat tall in the saddle, every inch the kind of man her mother had once warned her about, rough, confident, dangerous. Eleanor's heart pounded. She gripped the old pistol she'd taken from her stepfather's drawer. It was heavy and unfamiliar in her hand. The man turned his horse and began to ride toward her, slow and steady, like a hunter who already knew his prey couldn't run. When he was close enough to see her clearly, he raised a hand in greeting. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough. "You look like you've been through hell." Eleanor swallowed hard. "I'm managing fine, thank you." "Your horse says different," he said, nodding toward Buttercup, whose sides heaved with effort. "When's the last time either of you had water?" 2 days. The truth slipped out before she could stop it. The man swung down from his horse with easy grace. His clothes were dusty, his face tanned and marked by wind and sun, but there was something steady in his eyes, green, sharp, and watchful. He unhooked a canteen from his saddle and held it out to her. "Take it," he said. "You'll die before nightfall if you don't." Eleanor hesitated, her pride wrestling with desperation. Then she took it, her fingers brushing his calloused ones. The water was cool and clean, and the first sip nearly made her cry. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once. "Name's Jake Thornton." "I'm Mary," she lied quickly. "Mary Smith." Jake raised an eyebrow, the hint of a smile ghosting across his lips. "Sure you are, Miss Smith, and I suppose you're just out here for the fresh air." "My business is my own," she said stiffly. "That it is," he replied easily. "But this land don't care much about anyone's business. Kill you just as dead whether you're running to something or from it." His words sent a shiver through her, though not entirely from fear. He spoke like a man who'd lived it, who carried his own ghosts. "There's a water hole about 5 miles northwest," Jake said, adjusting his hat against the sun. "I'm headed that way. You can follow if you like, or strike out on your own." Eleanor studied him. Everything in her screamed not to trust strangers, especially men. But she needed water, and she needed Buttercup alive. "I can find it myself," she said. Jake shrugged. "Suit yourself. You'll pass a split rock that looks like a preacher's pulpit. Turn left there. Don't mind the rattlers." He swung into the saddle and turned away. Eleanor watched him for a long moment before calling out, "Mr. Thornton!" He stopped and looked back. "I'd be grateful for the guidance." Jake smiled faintly, tipping his hat. "Smart choice, Mary Smith. Let's get your horse to water before she drops." As she followed him across the wide, empty land, Eleanor realized she'd traded one kind of danger for another. But at least this one rode beside her instead of owning her. And for the first time since she'd fled Carson Creek, she felt the smallest spark of hope flicker to life. The waterhole lay hidden in a hollow of red rock, a small miracle in the endless stretch of dust and heat. Jake dismounted first, scanning the area with the alertness of a man who never fully relaxed. Only when he seemed satisfied did he motion for Eleanor to approach. "Let the horses drink first," he said, leading his bay gelding to the water's edge. "Not too fast. Make them sick." Eleanor tried to do the same with Buttercup, but the mare lunged for the water, desperate and trembling. Her strength gave out, trying to pull the reins, and before she could stop it, Jake's hand covered hers, steady and sure. "Easy," he murmured. "Slow and steady. That's it." Their hands stayed locked for a moment, longer than needed. The warmth of his skin, the steadiness of his touch. It stirred something inside her that scared her more than the desert ever had. When Buttercup had finished, Jake released the reins and stepped back. "You did fine," he said quietly. Eleanor sat down near the water and drank carefully. The first cool swallow burned her throat, before easing into relief. She didn't realize tears had gathered in her eyes until she caught him watching. "You never seen hard times before," he said, not unkindly. "I've seen plenty," she replied, straightening her shoulders. "Not like this," Jake said. He gestured toward the barren land stretching endlessly around them. "This country don't forgive mistakes. Whatever you're running from must be mighty bad." Eleanor stared into the rippling water. "My business is my own." He nodded once, lighting a cigarette with the ease of habit. "Fair enough. Just seems to me a woman who calls herself Mary Smith and rides a near-dead horse into the desert might be in over her head. I suppose you think I should have stayed home and married the man my stepfather sold me to," she snapped before realizing what she'd said. Jake froze, the cigarette halfway to his lips. Then he spoke softly. "That why you're out here?" Eleanor looked away, ashamed that the truth had slipped free. "Doesn't matter now." Jake didn't press. He just tossed the cigarette into the sand. "You've got grit. That's something. Most women in your shoes wouldn't have made it past town limits." He stood and glanced at the horizon. "We'll rest till evening, then ride. Nights are cooler. Safer." Eleanor nodded, grateful for his silence. They ate jerky from his saddlebag, tough and salty, and shared what little shade the mesquite trees offered. When she woke hours later, Jake was sitting nearby, sharpening his knife, the rhythm steady and patient. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice rough from sleep. He didn't look up. "Because I remember what it feels like to have nowhere to go." His answer stirred a quiet ache in her chest. Before she could reply, the sound of distant voices cut through the stillness. Rough. Male voices. Jake was on his feet in a heartbeat, hand on his gun. "Stay behind me," he whispered. 3 riders appeared at the edge of the hollow, dust trailing their horses. The lead man's face was pale and mean, like curdled milk. "Well, well," he drawled. "Jake Thornton, thought you'd be long gone from these parts." "Amos," Jake said flatly. "Still riding with trash, I see." Quote? The other men shifted, hands near their holsters. Amos grinned. "Now, that ain't friendly. We rode together once." "Before you burned a ranch with a family still inside," Jake said coldly. Amos shrugged. "Business is business." Then his eyes slid toward Eleanor. "Who's the lady?" Jake's stance tightened. "She's with me." "With you, huh? Pretty thing like that. Seems a shame to keep her all to yourself." Amos's grin turned cruel. Eleanor's stomach twisted. The way they looked at her made her skin crawl. She stood, clutching the old pistol, though her hands shook. Jake's voice came low and sharp. "You boys water your horses and move on, peaceful-like." 3-1, Jake. You always were good, but you ain't that good," Amos taunted. "No," Jake said, "but I'm good enough to drop you before your men clear leather. You want to test that?" The air turned heavy. Eleanor could hear the creak of saddles, the shifting of nervous horses. Amos's hand twitched near his gun, but Jake didn't blink. Then Jake said, almost casually, "You don't want her anyway. She's got the lung fever. I'm taking her to Culverson for treatment." Eleanor caught his glance and understood at once. She doubled over, coughing violently, pressing a hand to her mouth for effect. Amos flinched. "You serious?" Jake shrugged. "Your choice. She's contagious as sin. Heard it fills a man's lungs with blood before it kills him." "That did it." The other men shifted back, unease flickering across their faces. Disease was the one enemy no bullet could stop. "Come on, boys," Amos growled. "Ain't worth dying over." He spat in the dust and turned his horse. "You got lucky today, Thornton, but Carson's still paying good money for you, dead or alive." "Then tell Carson I'll see him soon," Jake replied. When the riders finally disappeared, Eleanor let out the breath she'd been holding. Her legs trembled so badly she nearly fell. "Lung fever?" she asked weakly. "First lie that came to mind," Jake said, checking his gun. "We need to ride. They'll figure out the truth soon enough." They rode hard until sunset, neither speaking much. When they finally stopped in a sheltered canyon, Eleanor helped unsaddle the horses, her hands still shaking. Jake handed her a piece of bread. "You did well back there," he said. "I nearly fainted." "Still kept your head." His eyes met hers in the firelight. "Most folks don't under pressure." Eleanor stared at him for a long moment, her heart thudding for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "You risked your life for me." Jake looked away, poking the fire with a stick. "Didn't do it for you." "Did it because I don't like men like Amos." "Then why keep helping me?" He hesitated before saying, "Had a sister once." "She'd have been about your age." Eleanor softened. "What happened to her?" Jake's jaw tightened. "Same kind of men who think women are property." He stood abruptly. "Get some sleep." "I'll keep watch." Eleanor lay on her blanket, pretending to rest, but her eyes stayed open. The fire cast his shadow long against the rocks, broad, steady, protective. She realized she trusted him, this outlaw, who carried more scars than smiles. As sleep finally pulled at her, she whispered, "Jake?" "Yeah?" "My name isn't Mary Smith." "I know," he said quietly. "Sleep, Eleanor May." She smiled faintly in the dark. For the first time since she'd fled Carson Creek, she felt safe. Dawn crept slowly over the canyon, soft and pale after a long, restless night. Jake was already awake, crouched by the dying embers of the fire, cleaning his rifle with careful, practiced hands. Eleanor stirred from her blanket, blinking against the morning chill. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. Jake didn't look up. Old habits die hard. She watched him for a moment, studying the lines of his face, the calm focus, the weariness in his eyes that went deeper than lack of rest. "You kept your promise," she said. "You kept me safe." He smiled faintly. Ain't safe yet. By mid-morning, they were back in the saddle, riding across country that grew rougher with every mile. Red rock gave way to stretches of sand and dry brush. The air shimmered with heat. When they finally stopped by a trickling stream to water the horses, Jake knelt to check Buttercup's legs, his touch gentle. "You're lucky," he said. "Most wouldn't have made it this far." "She's tougher than she looks," Eleanor replied, smiling softly. "So's her owner." Their eyes met, and the look that passed between them lingered. Then Jake stood, brushing dust from his hands. "We're about a day's ride from Culverson," he said. "You'll be safe there. Train station, plenty of folks around. You can start over." Eleanor's heart clenched at his tone, final, distant. "And what about you?" "Can't stay in one place. Carson's men are always watching. A bounty that high draws trouble like flies to a carcass." She swallowed. "You said you'd see me there." "I said I'd get you there," he corrected gently. The words hit harder than a slap. "So that's it?" she asked. "You save me, teach me to survive, then ride off and disappear?" Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You deserve better than a life spent running, Eleanor May. Better than a man like me." Quote, "You don't get to decide what I deserve," she said, voice trembling but firm. "I've been owned, sold, and told what's best for me my whole life. You're the first man who ever treated me like I had a choice. Don't take that away now." He met her eyes then, something raw, flickering behind his calm mask. "If you come with me, you'll always be looking over your shoulder. There'll be nights without food, days without water, and every lawman between here and California wanting my head. That's no kind of life for a lady." "Maybe I'm done being a lady," she whispered. Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed faintly across the valley. Both froze. Jake's head snapped up, eyes narrowing. "Riders," he said, "more than two." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Amos?" "Or worse," Jake muttered. "Get to cover." They scrambled into a narrow ravine, leading the horses behind them. The hoofbeats grew louder, then slowed near the ridge above. Voices drifted down, gruff, unfamiliar. "Tracks lead this way," one man said. "Two horses, maybe 3 days old. One's limping." Quote, "Thornton's, no doubt," another voice replied. "Carson wants him alive if possible." Eleanor's heart thudded. Carson, the man Jake had spoken of in half-whispered fragments, the one whose brother Jake had killed. Jake drew his revolver, his expression calm but grim. "They've been tracking me since before you ever left Carson Creek," he said quietly. "Guess my past caught up." Eleanor gripped the Colt he'd taught her to load. "Then we face it together." He looked at her then, really looked, and something shifted in his gaze. "You sure about that?" "I didn't come this far to start running now." Jake's lips curved in a faint smile, pride and sorrow mixing in his eyes. "You're a stubborn woman, Eleanor May. I learned from the best." The riders dismounted above them, boots scraped on stone. Jake motioned for her to stay low, then leaned around the edge of the rock and fired once. A shout answered. The battle exploded in thunder and dust. Eleanor fired too. Her shot clumsy but loud enough to startle one man's horse. Chaos followed. Gunfire, shouting, the acrid smell of smoke. Jake moved with deadly precision, his revolver steady, each shot measured. He dropped one man, then another, before ducking behind cover as bullets splintered the rocks above him. When the smoke cleared, only silence remained. Eleanor dared to breathe. "Are they?" "Gone," Jake said, reloading. "For now." He winced, pressing a hand to his side. Blood seeped through his shirt. Eleanor rushed to him, her hands trembling. "You're hit." "Just a graze," he lied, but the red spreading across the fabric said otherwise. She tore strips from her skirt and pressed them to the wound. "You saved me again," she whispered. Jake's hand found hers, warm despite the blood. "Maybe you saved me, too." For a long time, neither spoke. The desert stretched around them, endless and silent. Finally, Jake broke the stillness. "Carson won't stop. He'll keep sending men till he gets what he wants." Then we stop running, Eleanor said. We face him, together. Jake's gaze searched hers, weighing her words. Then he nodded slowly. All right, together. 2 days later, they reached the outskirts of Culverson. Dust clung to their clothes, and exhaustion dragged at their bones. But there was something stronger beneath it. Resolve. Jake's wound had started to heal thanks to Eleanor's careful tending. As the town came into view, he pulled his horse to a halt. This is where I leave you, he said softly. No, she said. This is where we start. He turned to her, eyes shadowed with pain and something deeper. Eleanor, I can't give you a home or peace or safety. She reached out, her voice steady. You already gave me more than that. You gave me my freedom. Jake hesitated. Then he took her hand, rough and scarred against her soft fingers. You're my first, Eleanor, he said quietly. First person since Maria who made me want to try again. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, and you'll be my last, the last man I ever trust, the last man I ever love. Quote, he pulled her into his arms, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, the outlaw and the runaway, the broken and the brave, finding in each other what neither thought they'd ever deserve. When they rode into Culverson, the people turned to stare. A tall man with a scar across his cheek, and a young woman beside him, chin high, eyes bright with something fierce and unbreakable. They found a preacher that afternoon in a small white church at the edge of town. Jake stood awkwardly in the doorway, hat in hand, while Eleanor looked up at him, her heart steady for the first time in her life. Guess this makes it official, he said, a faint smile tugging his lips. Not official, she whispered, her cheeks flushing. Just real. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the world in gold. Jake slipped his arm around her shoulders as they stepped into the light. Come on, Mrs. Thornton, he said. Let's go find our piece of the world. They rode west together, leaving behind the ghosts, the fear, and the desert that had nearly killed them both. What waited ahead wasn't certain, but it was theirs. And as the sky turned to fire above them, Eleanor thought of how far she'd come. From a frightened girl sold for debt, to a woman who'd fought for her own freedom. She'd been broken, remade, and reborn in the heart of the Wild West. And beside her rode the man who'd promised to be her last.